All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, friends, let's play a little game this morning, shall we? It's called Biden or Trump. Which of your favorite presidents is associated with the following news items? You ready for this? All right, let's start with an easy one. This president took a hardline war on drugs stance, firing staffers for self-reported marijuana use. You probably saw this one in the news or heard us cover it here. That would be Joseph Robinette Biden. Now, sticking with the drug war, this president expanded mandatory minimum sentencing for drug crimes involving anything similar to fentanyl, in spite of the fact that such mandatory minimums have been proven to fuel a mass incarceration crisis with, of course, huge racial disparities. That would be Donald Trump, but guess what, guys? Biden is sticking with it. Even though he campaigned on reversing those mandatory minimums, he is clinging to his 90s era tough on crime approach and keeping those expanded mandatory minimums in place, at least for now. Next up, this president presided over the lowest levels ever of refugees resettlement in modern history. What do you think? Well, a little bit of a trick question because I guess technically the answer here is both. Trump broke records for his heartless refugee policies, but Joe Biden is on track to outdo him in turning our backs on the most desperate and persecuted migrants in the world. According to an op-ed in the Washington Post, Biden is on track to resettle only 4,100 refugees this year. That would be the lowest number ever since that program was instituted back in 1980. All right, let's try one more. Which president responded to a migrant surge by funding security state crackdowns in Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala? Once again, that would be President Biden, who has chosen a police state approach to migration rather than one which would really address the reasons that people are so desperate that they would risk the very dangerous trek north. Now, I am not trying to set up some false equivalency here between Trump and Biden, but those news items I just mentioned, along with ones on Biden continuing to work on Trump's border wall, quietly abandoning his police oversight commission, offering equivocal comments on a new police killing at a traffic stop outside of Minneapolis, and pushing Colombia to restart their disastrous carcinogen spraying program in a wrong-headed war on drug effort, they paint a pretty interesting portrait. One that has got to be wildly disappointing to anyone like me who cares about criminal justice reform, and which also looks a whole lot like the actualizing of the law and order rhetoric that President Trump embraced, and which was, of course, ascendant through the 80s and 90s and has long been embraced by Joe Biden. On the other hand, and I don't want to overstate this, Biden has been somewhat more populist on economic issues than I expected. The relief bill was sizable. It was great for families especially. His priorities moving forward, they look pretty good too. The infrastructure package is too small, but it's going to help create union jobs, rebuilding this country. He wants to invest a lot in caregiving and universal pre-K policies. That, again, will be fantastic for families in particular. He wants to at least moderately increase taxes on the rich and corporations. He's kept the China tariffs in place to try to help rebalance our trade regime. And he went a hell of a lot further than Trump, though still not far enough on his Buy American executive order. If you look just at the Biden policies, what you come to see is a law and order stalwart with a left of center but still market-centric populist pro-family economic policy. Guys, serious question here. Is Biden the mythical populist right leader that we've heard so much about? I'm kind of kidding, but I'm also kind of not. After all, what does populist right actually mean? Typically, you would think of someone who embraces law and order and the war on drugs and restrictionist immigration policies, but mixes that with nationalist domestic economic policy that focuses on American workers and American families. Now, Biden's rhetoric might not sound exactly like that, but his actions, they sure look like it. And stylistically, of course, he's deeply religious, he's very patriotic, and he certainly talks a big game about unions and about the working class. I'm not the only one who has noticed the echoes in Bidenism to the unrealized ideology fueling Trump's 2016 campaign. Ross Douthat penned a thought-provoking column in a similar vein, arguing that Biden came along to, quote, scoop up elements of Trumpian populism and try the trick himself. He's entrenching protectionism in trade policy and arguably broadening the last administration's China hawkishness. He's trying to do the $1 trillion infrastructure plan that Steve Bannon promised, but the Trump administration never delivered. And he's taking the Senate GOP's inchoate ideas on family policy and outbidding them with new child spending. And right on cue, as I was writing this, it was announced that Biden is actually planning to make good on the promise to get us out of Afghanistan, setting a September 11th deadline. It's the topic of Sagar's Radar today. Now, Biden, in certain ways, is implementing the 2016 Trump agenda much more effectively than Trump ever could, and with all the good and, of course, plenty of bad that entails. Meanwhile, the Republicans, they're flailing around with no idea what to do with this perplexing state of affairs. What if white suburban liberals just went to the mat in order to elect a more effective Trump? And Sagar, I think the big piece that's missing here from Biden and the populist right is he doesn't own the libs, right? Like the rhetoric is wildly different, and there's a lot of rhetorical feints to liberals and especially like cultural liberalism. So there's no like bulwark there against the liberal culture that's ascended in America. But in terms of the policies here, it's pretty interesting how many pieces you could actually connect to the Trump economic 2016 agenda.
Yeah, and you know what's crazy? It's like the opposite of Trump, where Trump would talk like this, but then he wouldn't do it. He would do the opposite of it. Yeah, no, look, I've been pleasantly surprised by the Biden administration. Yeah, you're laying out somebody who I'm like, oh, I could get behind that. If Biden runs against some like Nikki Haley Republican, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do in 2024. And I think that is actually shows that he's a decent politician. Him and Ron Klain and many of them look at the most popular supermajority efforts of the Trump team and are like, yeah, we'll just do that. And especially if it departs from the legacy of the Obama administration. One of the really fascinating things that we've talked a lot about here is that Biden was always very perturbed at how Obama turned up his nose at him in particular and looked down on him with Hillary and all of that. They're basically just departing from all of the most unpopular and least sensible parts of the Obama administration legacy. Caving to the deficits, trying to negotiate, whatever here with the Tea Party, all this. They're much better, frankly, at looking at polls. You know, Ron Klain almost said something that could have come out of my mouth, where he's like, yeah, actually, this is a bipartisan bill. It just turns out that party isn't in touch with their voters. I was like, well, shit. I was like, is Ron Klain watching Rising? I don't know. But it's a smart point. He's White House Chief of Staff. I think that they have dialed into and learned from the biggest excesses and the worst mistakes of the Obama administration. People really forget. Obama in 2008 was an extraordinary, I wouldn't say culturally right because he wasn't at the time. He was culturally centrist. By today's standards, he's extraordinarily culturally right. Like in 2006, he was like not for gay marriage. He was immigration restriction. Him and Biden were both pro-wall. Obama even was like, I get resentful whenever I see them flying Mexican flags at rallies or speaking Spanish when I'm getting my car fixed. I mean, that's like a boomer thing that you would hear people say, right? And like these are, and that's why a lot of white
press one for English thing.
That is why a lot of white boomers voted for Obama in 2008. You know, 2012 he did win, but he did not win overwhelmingly. And in retrospect, easily could have been beaten by a Trumpian type figure.
I think anyone who's watched, if you just extrapolated who Biden has been in Washington over his 40 years here and extrapolated that to what you think he'd be as president, I think you would have to expect the like tough on crime, war on drugs stuff, which you like and I hate. That is entirely consistent with who he has been his entire career. I mean, he wasn't just kind of going along with what everybody else was doing.
Pushed it, right.
He led the charge. Those mandatory minimums are there because of Joe Biden. Like, he was the architect of so much of this. And in the campaign, it's like, he didn't exactly apologize for it or say he changed his ways, but he clearly said he was going to have this police oversight commission. That's fallen. They disbanded it. They just quietly got rid of it altogether. He said he wasn't going to continue construction on the border. I just saw a news item this morning that another family's being kicked off their land by the Biden administration to continue construction of the border wall. Okay? Firing the staffers for marijuana use. We haven't had any change in marijuana policy at the federal government level, even though, again, it's something Biden campaigned on and something he could do. The refugee thing is actually really interesting is the wrong word because I find it horrifying, but he signed this executive order early on that was like, oh, we're opening up, we're going to get back to our historical norms in terms of accepting refugees, people who have applied and already been accepted into the program. Flights were booked to resettle people here. But then there's a final directive that you have to sign to actually make that happen. And he just hasn't done it. So advocates thought, oh, maybe this is just a short oversight. Well, weeks went by, that turned to months. And now, as I said, he's on track to have the lowest number of refugee resettlements since the beginning of that program in 1980. So those things are actually, they're all consistent with who he's been. I would argue that the economic policy, and you all know I have a lot of issues with certain areas of it not going big enough, objecting to, totally ruling out Medicare for all, not pushing for the $15 minimum wage, and so many more things. But I would say the economic policy is a departure from who he's been in Washington.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when he was a senator from MBNA, doing the bidding of the financial industry because of his deep ties to them in Delaware.
Bankruptcy, 2005.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bankruptcy really hurting consumers there. I mean, he was consistently on the side of big financial interest in this country. And look, I mean, the tax increases are pretty piddling. They're still holding tight to the nothing will fundamentally change promise. But there has been a little bit of rethinking, I think, since the Obama era that makes what he's offering now a bit of a departure and a surprise from what his past trajectory has been in Washington.
It's fascinating because what you're named and for your objections are all like what the highest rated Fox segments would have been if he'd done it, right? So like on the refugee thing, oh man, they drove that thing to the bank back in 2015. You remember Mike Huckabee talking about jelly beans? He's like, well, if you have one bad jelly bean.
God.
Well, I mean, this shit works.
That was the whole
like,
thing with
it's
what
true.
was Trump, the snake thing?
Yeah, the snake.
Yeah, that was all about
I used to be able to
that.
recite it from memory because he would talk about it so many times. Yeah,
if Trump was doing it, they'd be so psyched about it.
Exactly.
And on the liberal side, if Trump did it, they'd be freaking out about it. Instead, you barely even, you probably didn't even know that. I only knew it because somebody wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post.
Yeah, it also makes it real hollow, all these refugees welcome signs I see around D.C. It's almost like they didn't really mean it, and it was all about cultural signaling. But that's a whole other story.
Yeah, well, and that is part of why he can get away with those things.
Yeah.
Because the people who, claim to care about it the most during the Trump administration, suddenly they're very quiet about it. Next on Rising, Roger Fisk and Marshall Kosloff. They are here for Team Rising when Rising returns.